Mr. Speaker, allow me to first congratulate you on your appointment to the National Assembly, as well as the previous Speaker, the Deputy Speaker, Mr. Lennox Schumann. I also want to acknowledge that we are meeting in the month of September, which is considered both Heritage Month as well as Education. And I think sometimes this gets over our heads. Mr. Speaker, I rise to give support and sustenance to the 2020 budget presented by the Honorable Bishop Juan Edgil, Minister of Public Works. But before I begin, I want to express my thanks publicly, and I remain humble to be chosen to serve as a minister of President Mohammed Irfan Ali's government. But Mr. Speaker, let me mention that this budget is being presented against the backdrop of our country coming out of an electoral gridlock that lasted more than 5 months, an impasse that has significantly hindered and encumbered the progress of our country's development. Mr. Speaker, never again must we allow the clandestine intentions of a few to hold our development back. Never also must we permit our economy to be eroded by the selfish and malicious actions of a group of elected officials that have led our country into a dungeon of hopelessness and despair. Mr. Speaker, thanks to the heroic and resilience of our President, His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Irfan Ali, Vice President Bharat Jagdeo, and a team of courageous persons, many of whom are sitting in this hall on this side, and I also recognize the Deputy Speaker, many of whom the private sector, the civil society, and others too numerous to mention, including international community. I'm not forgetting, but more importantly, the citizens of this country who stood up for democracy, and we are now able to put that chapter in the past. Mr. Speaker, this budget is a budget which caters for the poor and the ordinary man who has weathered the storm and who are deserving of a bright future, and the 2020 budget has been crafted to do just that, which is to ensure that every stratum and every sector in our country benefits. This budget provides an economic stimulus for the individual and his community. But these measures, we will see increased spending, which will lead to an increase in employment rate, which will in turn increase income and hence boost spending. Thanks to 2020 budget, we will see a prosperous country under the leadership of a competent government. Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy she arrived at the right time, the Honorable Ms. Ferguson, in her presentation to the Parliament, came here to present distorted facts on issues that has already been decided on by the electorate. The previous administration, for example, had no plan of action for this country. Hence, what we see in the Ministry of Housing and Water. The honorable member believes that she can continue to spin webs of deception in this honorable house, forgetting that the APNU, AFC is no longer in government And there is now a new and truthful dispensation to the management of the affairs of the people that we have been elected to serve. Mr. Speaker, the APNU-AFC operated visionless in the housing and water sector. The PPPC's government housing program is based on a profound understanding of the needs of our people for housing and years of service and satisfying their needs. The leadership and the governance of the APNU in 2015 to 2020 represents not just a pause, but a poverty of ideas. With the housing sector performing below par, riddled with incompetence and void of empathy to the needs of the people of this nation. Mr. Speaker, even after 3 government ministers within the span of less than 5 years, and the Honorable Edgell in his speech described as a musical chairs of ministers, this sector could not muster the steam required to meet the needs of Guyanese desiring to have their own homes. The coalition grappled to define its ambition in housing, completely losing sight of the needs and urgency with which they should decisively act. Mr. Speaker, let us take to the so-called massive public outreach at the Square of the Revolution just before elections, which show data that says housing has been overwhelmed by the priority needs of the people. The coalition has not been able to deliver. This should not be a surprise. The policy position of the coalition to defunct, and yes, defunct, the housing sector, mediocre leadership of every changing minister, a lack of private sector incentives, taxes on building materials, among others, strangle the housing sector, slowing its ability to contribute to the needs of the nation. Effectively, the ordinary Guyanese whose lives they purported to be interested in improving, let's look what happened. Effects on the housing sector, 2015-2019, immediately after taking office, the coalition in 2015 met $8 billion within the CHPA. The APNU-AFC government moved in post haste to defunct the entity, demonstrating a lack of care for the housing and the priority focus on the needs of the nation. When they left, there was only $3.6 billion in the coffers of CHPA. Mr. Speaker, this sector could never deliver given such policies, conditions, and leadership of the former government. Land sales declined from $3.6 billion in 2014 to as low as $580 million in 2017. In fact, never met half the performance of the PPPC government. And in 2018 and 2019, land sales were $1.49 billion and $1.484 billion respectively. House lots allocations went from 2,440 in 2014 to as low as 776 in 2018. Even after the evidence from the public outreach search showed that housing needs were the most desired, in 2019, the coalition still could not do it, allocating 1,220 house lots for that year. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Annette Ferguson should be ashamed to come here to speak about APNU AFC's record about house lots allocation. She proudly announced, the honorable member, that they distributed 7,000 plus in their entire 5-year period. What they did in 5 years, the PPPC government will do more than that in 1 year by distributing in the first year 10,000 house lots. The coalition would argue that by providing a complete home was their policy. But let the evidence show that at best they allocated 158 units in 2018, just 81 in 2019, when the nation cried out for housing as a basic and priority need. Mr. Speaker, the CHPA, Central Housing and Planning Authority, suffered from weak egotistical leadership. Not in my assessment. That's what the musical chairs of ministers reveal. CHPA has been inefficient, to say the least, under the coalition government. In 2014, under the PPPC, 4,079 transports were processed. At best, the coalition did 2,556, and at worst, 1,207 over the period of 2015 to 2019. This meant that the rate at which security of tenure was achieved through land title distribution declined. There are clear indications that the coalition never got a grip on managing, governing, and providing the leadership required to address this important need of the nation. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to announce that by the time we complete 4 months into office, not 1 year, the Ministry of Housing and Water will be distributing over 2,000 transports and titles. Mr. Speaker, the new PPPC administration under President Ali, who happens to be the immediate past Minister of Housing and Water, will restore the housing program to satisfy and surpass the expectation of the Guyanese people. The PPPC administration will, as asserted in the budget speech, restore vibrancy and vitality of the housing sector from the state of comatose to the coalition that the coalition had it in. Mr. Speaker, you should chew and listen. Mr. Speaker, listen and learn. The government will throw its weight into this sector as a priority by restoring investment. Immediately, $4 billion is allocated only for the last quarter. My colleague, Minister Rodriguez, the Honorable Minister within the Ministry of Housing and Water, outlined the details of the projects to be undertaken in the 2020 budget. The suite of measures indicated from improving transportation networks and water, affordability and access to financing, mortgage relief, among others, shall reinvigorate the housing sector. Mr. Speaker, These measures will increase the contribution of the housing sector to the gross development product, jobs, and ease the burden of electricity and water that complements dwelling in new and existing homes. More money in people's hands and command of more disposable income through adjustment measures for all Guyanese are sure to be directed to their own priorities. One we have seen over the years, and most recently, to be housing. Reversal of VAT on water and electricity should make living more sustainable by allowing homeowners and all else, especially the vulnerable, not be excessively stressed by utility bills. More income to dispose of. Mr. Speaker, this administration has indicated will achieve a minimum of over 50,000 house lots to be distributed over this current term in office. But in an effort to bridge the gap in the demand, which is at a backlog of 68,000 active applicants, the PPPC government will adopt a practical approach to the housing drive. One, through government's capital subvention. Two, the PPP approach, not the People's Progressive Party. Public-private partnership, private developers, and fourthly, through capital market financing. Mr. Speaker, we have already advertised, and it closed last Monday, for expression of interest to further develop the public-private partnership so that we can, in an aggressive way, start to tackle the backlog of cases. And as I speak, there are a number of persons, and we have already started to talk with the bank, because it is our intention as a government to raise capital market to help in the infrastructure development at a fast-track rate. This, along with the following measures, will serve to stimulate the sector. Mr. Speaker, mortgage interest relief for low and middle home income earners, increasing the limit for the low income loans, and a reversal of VAT on building materials where it was imposed, and measures to give increased access and availability to financing for home ownership within the reach of every citizen will be a goal of the Ministry of Housing and Water. It is part of the PPPC's government continued drive to increase the disposable income for every household. Mortgage interest relief. In 2013, the PPPC government introduced this initiative for persons with mortgages at the bank up to a ceiling of $30 million. In 2017, the coalition government reduced the ceiling to $15 million. This reduction negatively impacted upon approximately 55% of those borrowers. By reverting the ceiling to $30 million, those 55% of borrowers will now recover yearly approximately between $500,000 to $1 million. This is direct cash being returned to those individuals, and is another example of the government putting cash directly in the pockets of our citizens. Corporate tax relief. Mr. Speaker, with respect to increasing the low income threshold from $8 million to $10 million, the government is saving those persons who qualify approximately $100,000 annually. It will also allow for a larger number of persons to qualify for loans up to $10 million, giving them the opportunity to improve on the quality of houses being built. In addition, by raising the low-income tax concessions, commercial banks can now grant lower income mortgages at a higher ceiling and lower interest rate. This will allow more persons in the low income earning bracket to borrow. Removal of VAT on building and construction materials will reduce the construction cost significantly, whereby producing higher quality and homes and improving the living standards tremendously. Mr. Speaker, these measures will invigorate the sector and realize the aspirations of Guyanese in the housing drive. Mr. Speaker, we will also, as similarly mentioned by the Honorable Minister of Tourism, Industry and Commerce, we will be embarking on a single window processing permission for permits. And the intention is, Mr. Speaker, to reduce the processing time to under 1 month. Work has already started internally at the ministry. So therefore, the ease of doing business is one of the elements for attracting both domestic and external investors to the local economy. It has been recognized that the multiplicity of regulatory agencies leads to indefinite delays in approval of permits and licenses, and over the years, this has been a bugbear. Dealing with construction permits and licenses, for the most part, involve planning permission system whereby the CHPA is the principal element, with direct functional linkages with the local democratic organs, the fire service, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Central Board of Health, Guyana Lands and Survey, and so you will understand, Mr. Speaker, why there has been a delay. And it is our intention to implement a single window electronic permitting system that will focus on 3 facets: reducing, as I said, the permission time to under a month, and to ensure that we have the legislative changes that are required, that the Honorable Attorney General is leading a committee for this activity to ensure that we put the necessary software into place and we build the necessary infrastructure to implement the single window system. Hinterland housing program. Two former ministers spoke about the Hinterland housing program. Mr. Speaker, they should be ashamed to raise that program. The Hinterland housing program was an initiative of the People's Progressive Party civic government. But worse yet, as I stand here, the previous minister, there was no initiative to continue that program. There's not even a documentation to show any initiative to commence another round of the Hinterland program. I can say this, we have already started the work, and it is our intention in 2021 to resume the Hinterland housing program. Mr. Speaker, I want to make mention to provide a clarification. We are currently reviewing allocations, the allocations for house lots that were done and processed. It is to bring fairness and transparency to the processing and the allotment. This is in light of certain transactions coming to light. We have also noted in the run-up to the March elections, the processing of a number of allocations and transactions for new applicants, even within a month, while there are thousands who are waiting for years. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Housing is also working to ensure that we continue the plan for which was left in 2014 for a new location for the ministry. And we are currently reviewing, there was a prior cabinet approval for a location of a head office, a new head office for the Ministry of Housing and Water, and we will bring this back up so you can expect some work start in that regard so that we can provide sufficient office space and quality service for our citizens. Mr. Speaker, much like the rest, let me speak a little on water. Much like the rest of the economy, the leadership of GWI and management of GWI under the APNU were the worst in the company's history. If we were to show the performance of the company in the form of a Broadway musical, it would be appropriately named How to Run the Well Dry. Over the last 5 years, the financial situation at GWI has reached an all-time low. At the end of 2015, GWI ended the year with $1.3 billion in surplus.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
I'm listening.
thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, arise and stand in order number 48.
What's the standing order what's the point you're making?
The point of elucidation, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, the only way I can allow a point of elucidation is if the person on the floor would concede to you making that point of elucidation. Honorable member, Mr. Croal, would you allow the honorable member, Ms. Ferguson, to make an elucidation?
I sat and listened attentively, and so they have an opportunity at the end of my speech to give all the rebuttal that they require.
Thank you very much. Honorable member, Ms. Ferguson, I would not be able to allow that point of elucidation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, Minister of Housing and Water, Mr. Croal, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 5 years, the financial situation at GWI has reached an all-time low. At the end of 2015, GWI ended the year at $1.3 billion in surplus. At the end of August 2020, the company recorded almost $70 million in losses. The measure of true leadership is when those who you lead succeed and prosper. Under the APNU's leadership and management, GWI lost its own identity even worse than in its performance. GWI motto is water is life, save it. Under APNU, 70% of all the water that the company produces is wasted. They were not done with GWI. They were just getting started. At the end of 2015, GWI had in its employment about 600 persons. Currently, there are 1,319 persons in the employment of GWI, an increase of over 116%. But ironically, Mr. Speaker, with no notable improvement in the level and quality of service to customers, that has resulted in a decline in productivity of the employees. Mr. Speaker, we have kept our commitment in our manifesto. That is for free water for pensioners. Mr. Speaker, as a result, 25,620 pensioners will be able to benefit from this measure. The total value is $227 million as a result of the subsidy of the free water for pensioners. Let me break it down further. So I see the former minister's writing, so let me have her writing a little more.
Honorable member, before you can break it down further, you have to build up your time. So could I have someone move an extension for you, sir?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask that the honourable member be given another 5 minutes to conclude his very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Honorable Minister, Housing and Water, you have 5 minutes to conclude.
All right, so let me break down another category. Removal of VAT on water. Metered customers, as a result of this effect, 88,000 customers with 83,000 unmetered. A total of 172,324 customers will benefit to the value of $416 million. Mr. Speaker, the average employment cost was $94 million in 2015 compared to $239 million in 2020, an increase by 2.5 times. Indebtedness to GPL was $828 million in August against now $6.78 billion in 2020. GWI has long overdue amounts for goods and services procured from firms and individuals, totaling $783 million, of which $680 million was from previous debts for the past 5 years. Between 2015 to 2020, GWI total bank balances have deteriorated significantly by $1.76 billion, or 69% of the total bank balance as of 2015. Collections efficiency was at 61% as of August 31st, 2015. At August 31st, 2020, a decrease of 9% has ensued. Yet, we see an over 100% increase in staff. Mr. Speaker, customer complaints have increased in all the regions due to the low level of service as a result of water losses and leakages. This department, along with the Public Relations Department. Immediately, the new board, which has met last Friday, they have taken a decision to give this department a priority. No longer can we have where customers are reporting leakages, and for over a month, the complaint is still in the system, but yet when someone calls directly, the problem is fixed in an hour. GWI has procurement problems, and you know, the other side, when they like to talk about the glorification of the last government, it is former President David Granger that gets the praise. But when they come to GWI, all you hear is about baby Jesus. Well, let me tell you some of his story. He had already told you his record. Procurement has been a problem. Right now, the honorable member from Region 5, he knows there's an office that is expected to be completed in Region 5 for GWI. The original contracted sum for that building was $19.7 million. That was what was approved by the previous board. Mr. Speaker, they have spent to date $40.5 million on that building. And as I speak, they are requesting another $25 million to complete the building. Then you have another arrangement, sequest, which is costing the taxpayers of this country. It costs $1.8 billion in 4 years, $450 million per year, where they sole source a contractor to supply and for the treatment of well water for 28 wells. What was the findings? The company GWI did not even comply with its own procurement policy. There was no competitive bidding process. And so, Mr. Speaker, a decision has already been taken to terminate this contract because the taxpayers of this country must get value for water. So GWI's strategic plan will include achieving nationwide access to safe and affordable water for all in a sustainable manner. Provision of treated water to improve the water quality to the World Health Standards. Reduction of non-revenue water to improve the level and quality of service and financial viability, as well as, and more and equally important, to obtain financial and commercial viability and sustainability of the water sector. Our key focus, therefore, will also include extending water coverage throughout Guyana, including the hinterland communities, Honorable Don Hastings. Expanded treatment for water coverage throughout Guyana, and increasing our meter coverage. So, Mr. Speaker, sanitation is also included as part, as I wrap up, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, could you wind down? You're
Yes.
into 7 minutes.
The sanitation investments over the many years have been limited to solid waste via landfill facilities. However, there is now a need to turn our attention to wastewater treatment through resource recovery application. Guyana is expected to develop, as I conclude, Mr. Speaker, Guyana is expected to develop rapidly due to its advancement in the oil and gas sector, presenting several residential, commercial, and industrial development and that is proposed by the Central Housing and Planning Authority, and therefore sanitation and water delivery will play an equal important role in the housing sector. With those few remarks, Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much.